The bank manager's call froze my blood. "Sir, there's someone here trying to empty your savings account. He says he's your son with power of attorney." The boy I raised, the son I taught to drive. Then he whispered, "I recognized your name. You were my squad leader. I know you wouldn't do this." I hadn't. In that instant, the only wall between my retirement and my own flesh and blood was a man who remembered my name from a war. My name is Thomas Keller. I'm 72 years old, a retired master sergeant. I spent 26 years in the Marine Corps, 2 tours in Vietnam, and I thought I had seen the worst of what one human being could do to another. But nothing prepared me for what my own son tried to do to me in the cold, quiet lobby of a suburban bank. This is the story of how a bond forged in combat saved my life twice, once in a jungle firefight, and decades later across a bank counter. And it's the story of an invisible war being waged every single day against millions of aging parents by the very people they trust the most. But what I didn't know that morning was that a single phone call wasn't the end. It was the first crack in a much darker secret that would force me to ask the hardest question of my life. How do you survive when the enemy shares your blood? To understand how I found myself asking that question, I have to take you back 18 months before that phone call, to the day my son David first asked me for money he had no intention of paying back. I didn't know it then. I thought he was just struggling like a lot of men his age. He was 38 years old, married to a woman named Rachel, and they had a 3-year-old daughter named Lily. My granddaughter, the light of my life. And that was the lever they used. It was a Sunday afternoon in March, and David had driven up from his apartment in Columbus to have lunch with me in my kitchen. My house is a modest ranch in a quiet subdivision outside of Dayton. I bought it with my wife, Margaret, after I retired from the Corps. Margaret passed 6 years ago, and since then, I've kept everything exactly as she left it. The floral curtains, the ceramic rooster on the windowsill, the wooden spoon she used to stir her famous beef stew. The house is my anchor, and it's paid for. That detail matters more than you might think. David sat down at my table and didn't eat much. He pushed his food around with a fork and talked about the economy, about how hard it was for young families, about how he and Rachel were barely keeping their heads above water. I listened because that's what fathers do. Then he got to the point. He needed $15,000, a business opportunity, he said. A friend from work was starting a pressure washing company, and if David could buy into it, he'd own 40%. He had the whole thing mapped out on a piece of paper he'd folded into his shirt pocket. It looked promising, but I've seen promising plans blow up in a man's face. I told him I'd think about it. That night I called my friend Howard, a retired accountant who still does my taxes. Howard has a nose for things that don't add up. He asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask. Did David have a business plan? Did he have any experience in pressure washing? Who was this partner, and had I ever met him? I didn't have answers. I realized, sitting there on the phone with Howard, that I'd almost written a check for $15,000 based on nothing but a lunchtime conversation and a sheet of printer paper with some numbers on it. The next day, I called David and told him no. I didn't give him a long explanation. I just said I wasn't comfortable investing in something I didn't fully understand. His voice changed on the phone. He got quiet. Then he said, "Dad, this could have changed everything for us." The way he said it made me feel like I'd done something wrong. But I've learned over a long life that guilt is often the first weapon people use when they want something you're not ready to give. I told him I loved him and I hung up. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few weeks later, Rachel started calling. She'd never called me directly before. We were cordial, but we weren't close. She was a sharp, polished woman who worked as a real estate agent. She had a way of talking that made everything sound reasonable, even things that weren't. She told me that David was depressed, that he felt like I didn't believe in him, that all he wanted was a chance to build something for his family, and I had shut him down without even looking at his plan properly. She said, "Thomas, I know you're a careful man, but sometimes you have to take a risk for the people you love." She used the word love the way some people use sugar, to make something bitter go down easier. I stood my ground. I told her I was sorry David was upset, but my answer wasn't going to change. She sighed into the phone and said, "I just hope you don't regret this." The statement hung in the air like smoke. I didn't respond. I simply ended the call and wrote down the date and time in a spiral notebook I keep in my kitchen drawer. That notebook had started out as a place to record my blood pressure readings. It was about to become something else entirely. Over the next several months, the pressure intensified. David and Rachel began showing up at my house unannounced, always with a new angle. First, it was an emergency car repair they couldn't afford. Then it was a medical bill for Lily that their insurance supposedly didn't cover. Each time, the amount they needed was smaller, more desperate. I gave them money for Lily's bill. I'm not a monster, but I paid it directly to the doctor's office, not to them. Rachel seemed irritated by that, which I noted in my notebook. Then came the day I noticed my mail had been tampered with. I have a locking mailbox at the end of my driveway, but one afternoon I found the back flap slightly ajar and several envelopes stacked haphazardly inside, as if someone had rifled through them, pulled out what they wanted, and hastily pushed the rest back in. A bank statement was missing. When I called the bank to ask for a duplicate, the customer service representative told me someone had already called that week asking for my account balance. She said they had my full name and social security number, but they couldn't answer the security question about my first pet's name, so the call was flagged. My blood went cold. I knew in my gut who was behind it, but I didn't have proof. I changed all my passwords, set up additional security on my accounts, and documented every detail in my notebook. The notebook was now filling up fast. I sat down with my son in early August and confronted him directly. He denied everything. His face was pale and his eyes couldn't meet mine. He blamed it on a neighbor, on mail theft, on anything but himself. Then Rachel, who was listening from the next room, stepped in and turned the conversation around on me. She said I was becoming paranoid. She said it was sad, an old man alone in a big house, seeing enemies everywhere. She said maybe it was time to think about my mental fitness. The implication was clear. If I wasn't careful, they would try to have me declared incompetent. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a son who was struggling. I was dealing with a coordinated effort to take what was mine. I hired an attorney, a woman named Judith Price, who specialized in elder law. She was blunt and efficient. She told me that elder financial abuse by family members is the most common form of exploitation, and it's also the most underreported. She told me that the combination of shame and love makes victims hesitate, and by the time they act, their savings are often gone. She helped me draft a formal letter to David and Rachel, stating that any further harassment would be met with legal action. I sent it by certified mail. They stopped calling for a while, but they didn't stop scheming. The final move came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was sitting at my kitchen table, finishing my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. The caller ID read First National Bank. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct made me pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to a man I hadn't spoken to in 47 years. He said, "Sergeant Keller, sir, this is Corporal Michael Reyes. We met in the jungle outside Da Nang, 1968. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your son is in my lobby right now, and he's trying to empty your entire savings account." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles cracked. I could hear the muffled sounds of the lobby behind him, murmuring voices, a chair scraping the floor. My son was standing 20 feet away from a man who had once carried me through a rice paddy under fire, and he had no idea. "Michael," I said, "do not let that man leave the building." Michael Reyes didn't hesitate. He had been a radio man in my platoon, one of 3 survivors from a night ambush that should have killed us all. He knew how to follow an order, and he knew what it meant when a man gave one quietly. He locked the lobby doors, alerted his security officer, and kept my son seated with the calm, unhurried patience of a man who has seen far worse than a liar in a cheap blazer. I drove to the First National Bank on East 3rd Street in just under 12 minutes. It was a plate glass and sandstone building, the kind that still smells like the 1970s inside. I parked in the fire lane and didn't care. When I walked through those automatic doors, the first thing I saw was Michael behind the manager's desk. He had the same steady eyes I remembered, older now, his hair silver and his shoulders slightly rounded, but the posture was the same. The second thing I saw was my son. David sat in a chair across from him, looking at the floor. He was clutching a manila folder and his leg was shaking. David looked up when I walked in. His face didn't register shame. It registered calculation. He was trying to figure out whether he could still talk his way out. That expression, in the eyes of a child I had taught to ride a bike, to drive a stick shift, to salute an officer, it broke something in me that I am still learning to name. Michael stood and greeted me with a handshake that said everything words couldn't. Then he spread the contents of the folder on his desk. There was a document titled Durable Power of Attorney, signed with a version of my name that looked almost convincing. There was a letter from a physician named Dr. Leonard R. Crane, stating that I was incapacitated and unable to manage my own affairs. It was dated 6 weeks ago. I had never met Dr. Crane. I had never been examined by Dr. Crane. I had never even heard his name. There was also a change of address form that had redirected my bank statements to a post office box in Columbus, filed 3 months before, and a wire transfer request for $234,000, essentially my entire life savings, to an account at an out-of-state credit union. I turned to my son. My voice came out low, and even the way it does when something inside you is closed like a blast door. "Look at me." He wouldn't. "David, look at your father." He raised his chin and his eyes were wet, but whether from regret or from being caught, I couldn't tell. I asked him one question. "How long have you been planning this?" He didn't answer. He just said, "Dad, you don't understand." The police arrived 5 minutes later. Michael had called them before I even got there. 2 officers separated David and me, and I watched them cuff my son's hands behind his back. The boy who had fallen asleep on my chest watching football, the boy whose lunch I packed every morning for 12 years. That image stays with you. It fills your mouth with a taste like old metal, and it does not leave. What I learned over the next 48 hours rewrote the entire story I thought I had been living. The detective assigned to my case, a sharp young woman named Detective Fletcher, pulled credit reports and bank filings I hadn't seen. David and Rachel had not just tried to empty my savings. They had opened 3 credit cards in my name over the previous 18 months and racked up over $34,000 in debt. They had intercepted a home equity line of credit application and forged my signature on it, an attempt that was denied only because the bank in question flagged a mismatched social security number. They had redirected my pension disbursement statement to a digital mailbox, and they were within 2 weeks of rerouting the direct deposit itself. Had Michael not recognized my name that Tuesday morning, I would have woken up in 60 days to an empty account, a ruined credit rating, and a home I could no longer afford to keep. Detective Fletcher told me I was one of the lucky ones. "Mr. Keller," she said, "we see elderly victims lose everything before they even realize something's wrong, and in 80% of those cases, it's a family member." She said it without flinching, the way you deliver a fact that is also a tragedy. She told me that Americans age 60 and older lose more than $28 billion to financial exploitation every year. Family members and caregivers are the most common perpetrators: sons, daughters, in-laws, the people you break bread with. And veterans are especially vulnerable. They have guaranteed income streams, military pensions, VA benefits, and they come from a generation that values loyalty over suspicion. Scammers know that. They exploit the very trust that defines the veteran's character. In 2024 alone, the military community filed more than 210,000 fraud reports, with losses topping $584 million. And that only counts the ones who reported it. The shame ensures that the true number is far, far higher. That shame sat on my chest like a stone. I had spent 26 years in the Marines serving my country. I had raised a son. And yet my own flesh and blood had spent 18 months systematically trying to dismantle my entire life, and I had missed it because I could not believe what the evidence was telling me. But here is the thing, I did not miss it. My neighbor didn't see it. My friends didn't see it. The system didn't see it. But Michael Reyes saw it. A single employee at a local bank saw a name on a screen, and it lit a circuit in his memory from 1968. The night our platoon was pinned down in a monsoon, and a young radio man had dragged me through mud while I bled from a shrapnel wound. That memory saved me twice. Michael had trained his staff to spot elder fraud. He had posters in the break room. He had a checklist of red flags on every teller's monitor, customers who suddenly bring in a younger relative, who ask unusual questions, who come in flanked by someone who does all the talking. He had personally reported 17 suspected cases to Adult Protective Services in the past 2 years. 17. And yet most people will never hear his name. Most people don't know that the quiet man in the navy blazer at the teller window is sometimes the only firewall between a veteran and oblivion. I filed a formal police report. I turned over every document, every forged signature, every falsified medical letter. The district attorney took the case seriously because the paper trail was undeniable. David was charged with felony identity theft, attempted grand theft, and forgery. Rachel was named as a co-conspirator after investigators found her fingerprints on the envelope containing the forged power of attorney. She was arrested at their apartment the next morning, with Lily in the other room. But the hardest blow was yet to come. The police had barely escorted my son out of the bank when my phone buzzed again. It was a text from Rachel. It read, "If you don't drop the charges today, you will never see your granddaughter again." I stared at that text until the screen dimmed. My granddaughter Lily was 3 years old. She had my wife's laugh and a stubborn streak I recognized the moment she first shook her head at a spoonful of peas. And now her mother was holding her like a hostage. I did not respond to the text. I forwarded it to Detective Fletcher, then I called Judith Price. She answered on the second ring and I told her what had happened. She didn't sound surprised. She told me that threats involving grandchildren are a fingerprint of elder exploitation. The abuser, cornered, uses the one thing the victim still loves unconditionally. I asked her if the charges could be dropped. She said it was complicated. Felony charges don't vanish because a victim blinks. The state had an interest now. But she also told me something that made my stomach turn. "Thomas," she said, "if you push the prosecutor to go easy, you may keep seeing Lily. But you'll also guarantee David does this to someone else. And it won't be a Michael Reyes who stops him next time. It'll be an empty bank account and a nursing home the state pays for." Detective Fletcher's investigation accelerated. Within 3 days, she had pulled the full financial picture. The physician who had signed my incapacity letter, a Dr. Leonard R. Crane, turned out to be a real person, a retired orthopedic surgeon living in an assisted living facility in Indianapolis, who had lost his medical license 8 years ago after a dementia diagnosis. He had no idea his name had been used on a forgery. Rachel's sister, it turned out, was a nursing aide at that very facility. She had access to old letterhead and patient records. The fraud had fingerprints everywhere, none of them belonging only to my son. Then came the escalation I did not see coming. 2 days after David's arrest, I received a call from a woman named Carla Brimley. She was a social worker with the Montgomery County Department of Job and Family Services. She said a report had been filed alleging that I was no longer fit to care for myself, that I suffered from paranoia and erratic behavior, and that my home was an unsafe environment for a young child. The report had been submitted by Rachel Keller, who was requesting emergency custody of Lily from the grandmother's side. She was painting me as the unstable one, claiming I had attacked her husband at the bank. I was being framed as the aggressor in a crime where I was the victim. This is what abusers do when the walls close in. They build a new story, one where they are the heroes and you are the monster. I met Judith at her office that afternoon. She had already prepared a response. A detailed affidavit supported by my medical records, the police report, and a statement from Michael Reyes attesting to what he witnessed in the bank lobby. She filed it with the court that same day, along with a motion to dismiss the custody petition as frivolous and retaliatory. The judge saw through it quickly, but the process still took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of not knowing whether I would see Lily's face again. Rachel, true to her word, blocked all contact. She changed her phone number. She kept Lily from preschool. My son, sitting in county lockup on a $50,000 bond, refused to take my calls. I was told by his public defender that he had been instructed not to speak with me directly. In the silence of those weeks, I went through every document in my house. I found things I'd missed. A credit card statement for an account I never opened, sent to a post office box I'd never authorized. A life insurance policy taken out in my name 3 years earlier, with Rachel listed as the primary beneficiary, a policy I had never signed. A notarized letter, dated 2 years before, claiming I had gifted my entire savings account to my son and daughter-in-law in consideration of their love and care. It bore a notary stamp from a woman named Susan Merrick, who Detective Fletcher subsequently determined was a close friend of Rachel's from her real estate office. The notary had been forged, the stamp stolen. Judith filed a motion to add additional charges: forgery, grand theft by deception, conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The district attorney, a man named Alan Cross, took a personal interest in my case. He told me he had prosecuted 17 elder fraud cases in the past 5 years, and only 4 had gone to trial. The rest had been pled down to misdemeanors because the victims were too ashamed to testify, or too forgiving, or simply too tired to endure a courtroom. He said, "Mr. Keller, if you're willing to stand up, this one can send a message." I told him I would stand. But the worst moment, the one that changed the entire architecture of my understanding, came the week before the preliminary hearing. Detective Fletcher asked me to come to the station. She had pulled phone records and text logs from David's phone, which had been seized during the arrest. She laid out a timeline on the wall of her conference room, a matrix of dates and names and dollar amounts. And then she showed me something that had nothing to do with me. 3 other names, 3 other elderly victims, a widower named Arthur Vance, a retired teacher named Alina Shipley, and a disabled Navy veteran named Robert Clemens. All of them had been targeted by David and Rachel over the past 4 years. All of them had lost money. Arthur Vance had lost $42,000 before he died, never knowing it had been stolen. Alina Shipley had been moved into a Medicaid facility after her savings vanished, convinced she had simply mismanaged her own finances. And Robert Clemens had reported his case to the police, but it went nowhere because he had no proof, and no one believed an old man with memory lapses. My son and his wife had been running a systematic scheme, and I was not the first victim. I was simply the one they had finally tried to destroy completely. Detective Fletcher told me that in the past decade, elder financial abuse has become the fastest-growing form of exploitation in America. The Federal Trade Commission received nearly 50,000 identity theft complaints from military consumers and veterans in a single year. But that number, she said, is a fraction of the truth. For every case reported, experts estimate between 5 and 40 go unreported, buried under shame and fear. And here, in my own family, the pattern had been operating in plain sight. I sat in that chair, the cold air of the station blowing over me, and I felt the weight of a truth I had been resisting. My son was not a desperate man. He was a predator who had learned to wear the face of the people he attacked. That night I drove to the cemetery where Margaret is buried. I stood by her stone in the dark and I talked to her for the first time in months, out loud, the way you only talk to the dead. I told her what our son had become. I asked her what she would have done, and in the silence I heard her voice the way I always had, clear and certain. She would have fought, not for revenge, but for the innocent people who would come next if someone didn't stop this. The preliminary hearing was set for a Thursday in mid-November. Rachel was out on her own bond, still claiming innocence, still telling her family that I had manipulated the police. Her parents, Raymond and Gloria, had taken her side publicly, posting on social media that I was a bitter old man punishing his son for imagined slights. The community was divided. Some of my neighbors stopped making eye contact, but the evidence was not divided. It was a mountain. And Michael Reyes was ready to testify about exactly what he had seen. The day before the hearing, my phone rang again. It was Rachel, not a text this time. She was crying. She said she was sorry, that David was sorry, that everything had gotten out of control. She said she would let me see Lily if I would just ask the prosecutor to reduce the charges. She said a felony would ruin their lives, that Lily would grow up without parents. I listened. I let her finish. And then I said the words I never imagined I would say to my own family. Rachel, you made choices. I didn't make them for you. Lily will know the truth one day, and she will know that I fought for her future when you were fighting to steal mine. I hung up, and I did not cry until I was alone. The next morning, I put on my dress blues. I hadn't worn them in years, but they still fit. I stood in the mirror and saw the man I used to be, a man who had faced death and held the line. I was 72 years old, and I was about to walk into a courtroom and do something harder than combat. I was going to testify against my only son, in front of a judge, in front of a jury, in front of the world. Because the foundation of a life is not built on what you're willing to accept. It's built on what you're willing to defend, and I was ready. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Not the grand, wood-paneled chambers you see on television, but a functional room with fluorescent lights and worn carpet the color of old mustard. But the gravity inside it was immense. My son sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting suit, his hands cuffed in front of him. Rachel sat 3 rows back, flanked by her parents, her face a careful mask of grief. And in the gallery, behind the rail, sat a woman in a blue blazer and a man with a notebook. The woman was from the district attorney's Elder Justice Unit. The man was a reporter from the Dayton Daily News. I had not called them, but word travels fast when a veteran testifies against his own son. Michael Reyes was the prosecution's first witness. He walked to the stand with that same unshakable calm, and he described, in plain language, exactly what he saw. The forged power of attorney, the medical letter from a doctor who didn't exist, the wire transfer request that would have emptied my account. He identified the signatures as forgeries, not because he was a handwriting expert, but because he had been trained to spot the subtle hesitation in a line that doesn't belong. He had trained his entire staff the same way. The prosecutor asked him how many cases of elder fraud he had intervened in over the past 2 years. He said 21. That number hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand in my dress blues. The prosecutor, Mr. Cross, asked me to identify the man at the defendant's table. I pointed at my son. His lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. I told the court that David was my only child, that I had loved him since the moment he was born, that I had worked 2 jobs after Margaret died so he could finish college. And then I told them about the 18 months of theft, lies, and forgery. I told them about the $15,000 loan request that was never a loan. I told them about the mail theft, the credit cards opened in my name, the home equity line application. I told them about the night I found a life insurance policy with Rachel's name on it, a policy I never signed, designed to pay out upon my death. I told them about the 3 other elderly victims, and I named them one by one. Arthur Vance, Eleanor Shipley, Robert Clemens. People who had no one left to speak for them. The courtroom was silent. Not the silence of a library, but the silence of a room where something fundamental has shifted. Rachel's mask cracked. Her mother began to weep. And David stared at the table in front of him, the same way he had stared at my kitchen table as a boy when he was in trouble. But he was not a boy. He was a man who had tried to erase me. The defense called no witnesses. There were none to call. David's attorney argued that my son had been under financial strain, that Rachel had been the driving force, that David was a victim of circumstance and a domineering wife. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge, a man named Harold Finch, was a veteran himself. He had served in the army during the First Gulf War. He didn't need to say it. His eyes, when he looked at my son, said everything. The preliminary hearing lasted 2 days. At the end, Judge Finch bound the case over for trial on all felony counts. David's bond was revoked. He was taken back into custody, and as he was let out, he turned and looked at me. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't look away. I owed him that much and no more. Rachel accepted a plea deal 3 weeks later. She pled guilty to conspiracy to commit identity theft and elder exploitation. In exchange for her testimony against David and her full cooperation with the investigation into the other victims, she received a sentence of 5 years, suspended after 18 months, and 5 years of probation. But the real condition was this: she lost custody of Lily. The court awarded temporary guardianship to Rachel's older brother, a man who had quietly refused to support her during the trial and who had, in his own words, watched this train coming for years. He was a decent man, and he promised me I would see my granddaughter. He kept that promise. David's trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to my testimony, the prosecution presented the phone records, the forged documents, the testimony of the retired Dr. Crane's son, who confirmed his father could not have signed anything, and the notary Susan Merrick, who broke down on the stand and admitted she had been manipulated by Rachel. David was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in state prison, with a recommendation for elder fraud counseling and restitution. He will be 52 years old when he is released. I do not know if I will still be alive. I do not know if it will matter. But the story does not end in that courtroom. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter at my home. It was from the family of Alina Shipley, the retired teacher. Her daughter had read about my case in the newspaper. She wrote to thank me for speaking her mother's name aloud in court. She said that for years, the family had believed Alina had simply become confused, that her money had been lost to bad investments and forgetfulness. They had never suspected David and Rachel. And they would never have known the truth if the fraud had not been exposed. The letter ended with a sentence I have read 100 times. You not only saved yourself, you gave my mother back her dignity. That letter lit something in me. I began speaking at community centers and veterans halls. I told my story not for sympathy but for education. I told people about the red flags, the sudden appearance of a relative who insists on managing your finances, the missing mail, the new accounts you didn't open, the pressure to sign documents without reading them. I told them to keep a notebook. I told them that the shame belongs to the thief, not the victim. And I told them about Michael Reyes, the bank manager who remembered a name from a war and stopped a crime before it was complete. Because the truth is, for every Michael, there are thousands of elderly Americans whose names are not remembered, whose accounts are emptied in silence, and whose families never know until it is too late. I still live in the same ranch house outside Dayton. The ceramic rooster is still on the windowsill. Margaret's wooden spoon still hangs on the kitchen wall. And on Sunday afternoons, Lily comes to visit. She is 5 years old now. She doesn't know the details of what happened, and she may not for many years. But she knows that her grandfather loves her. She knows that she is safe in this house. And when she asks me to tell her a story, I don't tell her this one. Not yet. Instead, I tell her about the day I met her grandmother at a USO dance in 1972, about how she laughed and the whole room lit up. I tell her about oak trees and bridges, and what it means to hold steady when the ground shakes. I have kept the spiral notebook from those 18 months. It sits on my nightstand, filled with dates and names and the record of a life I almost lost. Sometimes, before I go to sleep, I read through it, not to remember the pain, but to remember that I held the line. The enemy did share my blood, but the foundation held. What I learned in that courtroom, and in the months that followed, is that elder abuse is not a private tragedy. It is a public epidemic hiding in plain sight, behind the closed curtains of quiet neighborhoods and the forced smiles at family gatherings. We think of predators as strangers, but the data tells a different story. The Department of Justice estimates that for every case of financial exploitation reported to authorities, 44 others go unspoken. The shame is so heavy that victims would rather lose everything than admit they raised a child capable of such cruelty. But silence is exactly what the abuser counts on. They weaponize love. They count on loyalty to outlast decency. And too often it works. I was lucky, not because I was smart. I missed the signs for 18 months. Not because I was strong. I nearly collapsed when they used my granddaughter as leverage. I was lucky because a single bank employee, a man who hadn't seen my face in 47 years, recognized my name and chose to act. That is the razor-thin margin between security and ruin for millions of American seniors right now. A teller who asks one extra question. A manager who checks a signature. A phone call made before the money moves. But Michael Reyes is not an accident. He is a product of training, vigilance, and institutional commitment. And that matters because his model can be replicated. Every bank, every credit union, every financial institution that touches a senior's savings has the power to build that firewall. The red flags are known. The training exists. What's missing in too many places is the will. That has to change. I think about Arthur Vance, the widower who lost $42,000 before he died, never knowing. I think about Alina Shipley, who ended her days in a Medicaid bed, convinced she had failed herself. I think about Robert Clemens, the Navy veteran who reported his theft but was dismissed. Their stories didn't have a Michael Reyes. Their stories didn't have a courtroom revelation. Their stories ended in silence. I carry them with me as a responsibility. There's a phrase from my Marine Corps days that comes back to me now. It's what unit commanders say when a position is under attack and the line must be held. No one gets past this point. That is what we need from our financial institutions, our adult protective services, our law enforcement, our communities. A line that the predators cannot cross, no matter whose blood they claim. If you are a senior with a suspicion gnawing at the edge of your peace, I am asking you to trust that instinct. Write it down. Call a lawyer. Call your bank. Do not let the fear of being called cruel stop you from being safe. And if you are a child, a grandchild, a neighbor, a caregiver, watch. Pay attention to the mail. Notice who hovers. Notice who insists. The people who love you will never rush you into a decision that could destroy your future. My son is in prison. My granddaughter laughs in my kitchen on Sunday afternoons. The oak tree Margaret and I planted has grown another 3 feet. The ceramic rooster still faces east. I am still here, holding the line, and as long as I can speak, I will. This is a new kind of battle, and it needs an army. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of ordinary people who refuse to be erased. And if you or someone you know is facing financial exploitation, the National Elder Fraud Hotline is one call away. The number is on your screen. You are not alone. No one gets past this point. That is a promise.